How do we know when we would have reached the point of the metaphor, leaving our raft behind? And of course, this references the key metaphor within Buddhism, the notion that the teaching is like a raft. The raft gets us across the sea of suffering to the other shore of enlightenment. And the point being that when we reach the other shore, we shouldn't carry the raft on our back. We should leave it behind. And, I guess there are a couple of kinds of responses I could give to this question. One, for those who actually attain some kind of ultimate enlightenment, arhatship, or even Buddhahood. But I think there's an interpretation that can be made short of that. And here is what I would say, that I think one of the fundamental problems in, frankly, all religious traditions is when the belief system becomes concretized in a literal form. In other words, fundamentalism is what it boils down to. The idea that a person is so locked into the exact words of a particular doctrine, a particular scripture, that he or she cannot have the mental flexibility to realize that it is a raft, that it is merely a way to get to a more enlightened state, a more liberated state, a state that is freer from suffering. Even if it doesn't result in, so to speak, the ultimate, however one imagines nirvana or enlightenment to be, different teachings and scriptures can help us along the spiritual path. But again, to the extent that we lock into one and feel like this is the way, this is the only way, and if somebody doesn't believe this way, they're not going to get to the other shore, then I think we've got a problem. So again, my response to this, how would we know? We know when we have the flexibility to realize that our particular path, our particular raft, so to speak, is not the only raft on the sea, is not the only way, not the only path. And I've just been doing some reciting from the great sage Nagarjuna, who was in the early part of the Common Era, one of the great philosophers who articulated the notion of emptiness or sunyata through a process of philosophical negation. And he himself, in so many words, says there are many paths. There are paths that, I think the way he puts it is, there are paths that involve one taking a boat across the sea, which he would consider to be an easier path as compared to a path that involves going across the land. So again, that's sort of mixing metaphors, but the idea here is that there are multiple paths. Just as the Buddha teaches in the second chapter of the Lotus Sutra, when he indicates that all these doctrinal kinds of formulations, all these scriptures, each one of them is an expedient means, is a provisional means to the ultimate sense of freedom that comes from the attainment of enlightenment. But again, I think this metaphor of the raft can have applicability short of that ultimate attainment. How do you view the nature of consciousness? Is it a phenomenon that just exists in everything and we happen to tune in, or something that only happens in humans and related to the brain, such as rationality? I have to tell you that these questions are coming from basically advanced high school students, and I am impressed with how bright they are and how thoughtful they are in the context of creating some of these questions. This person has raised a question that really nobody knows the answer to, in terms of what is the nature of consciousness. We all have a sense of consciousness, a sense of somehow realizing that we are in a world that we are experiencing. We don't know what the sort of reality is, the degree of concrete reality is of that world that we perceive with our senses, because really the only thing we know for sure is what we perceive with our senses. But the nature of consciousness is a puzzle that people will be focusing on increasingly over the course of time as one of the most profound and ultimate questions that one can ask of science, really, or of a religious tradition. Now, the religious tradition of Buddhism, of course, would say something along these lines. If we look, for example, at the mind only, kind of approach of the Yogacarans, which is reflected to some extent in the Lankavatara Sutra or in the Awakening of Faith, which I'm doing some recitation of now, that, basically they would say that consciousness is all there is. That is the reality, that the idea of an external world is an illusion. Now, I don't necessarily go that far in the sense that I would say more that the nature of the so-called objective reality that we perceive with our senses, that it neither exists nor does not exist. And I think that actually is a more accurate reading within the Lankavatara Sutra. In other words, again, what it's trying to point us toward is a sense of consciousness at a more fundamental level being an experience of non-duality, an experience that transcends our thinking mind or ability to, or our tendency to break the world down into this versus that. Now, that may not be a very satisfactory answer because, again, this is a very difficult question. I frankly like the theory that this student is positing in terms of phenomena that just exists in everything and we happen to tune in. Yeah, we are tuning in. And the more we can tune in a sense, to that which exists in us and around us in some kind of continuous way, that we're likely to have a better insight into the nature of reality. Now, that's getting a little woo-woo, and I won't get into that necessarily further, but this is a question worth pondering. What is the nature of consciousness? Do you celebrate Christmas as a Buddhist? Well, I live in the United States of America, and when Christmas comes around, it is pervasive within this culture, particularly within the southern or southeastern United States of America, because it's largely a Christian country and a Christian part of the country. So again, inherent in my existence within this particular culture, yes, I celebrate Christmas, although frankly I did so more when my son was young than I do now, as far as that goes. But I want to piggyback off of this question to make the point that I am not very knowledgeable about Buddhist holidays. In general terms, my impression is that the three key holidays have to do with when the Buddha was born, when he became enlightened, and when he died. When he entered parinirvana is the way his death is framed. But I would encourage you, anybody who's interested, and I've gotten this question before and really don't have answers off the top of my head, that if you're interested in Buddhist holidays, there's plenty of good stuff on the internet that will help describe those and what their origin was and what folks within Buddhist cultures do to celebrate those various holidays. But as far as living here in the United States, it's hard to get away from the Christian holidays. And nor am I particularly motivated to do so. I do advocate for separation of church and state, which is a fundamental doctrine within the Constitution of the United States. And that means that I don't think that public venues should support necessarily one religion, particularly one religion over another religion. So that, for example, if the city hall wants to put up a nativity scene, I would be advocating for them also to be willing to put up various ritual symbols that would be associated with the Jewish faith or the Muslim faith, etc. The question here is, why did you become a Buddhist? And if you go to the video, I think it's called My Journey to the Nembutsu, I give a description of what my experience was back in 1979 when I had a spiritual awakening kind of experience outside the context of any particular religion. And I chose Buddhism because it seemed to me not only to resonate with the experience that I was having, but also from an intellectual point of view, it had this notion of multiple paths as being legitimate. And so it seemed like a broader kind of approach that had greater tolerance, or at least the potential for greater tolerance. Now, any religion can be perverted, so to speak, but in general, I think given the kind of teachings in the Prajnaparamita Sutras, in the Lotus Sutra, in the various Mahayana Sutras, as well as the very solid sort of psychologically oriented teachings within the earlier forms of Buddhism in the Pali Canon, that there just seemed like a whole lot there that could meet the spiritual needs of people, no matter what their personalities or needs, as far as what kind of approach would accommodate their particular mental and environmental circumstances. In other words, I just felt like that one was the one that I wanted to put forward to people as representing, from my point of view, the approach that had the greatest flexibility to encompass all the various approaches of religious doctrines, or at least those that encompass the elements of wisdom and compassion. Do you have to be Indian or Asian to be a true Buddhist? And the word true is underlined. And the answer, of course, is absolutely not. I mean, there are many, 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 many Buddhists, tens of thousands, if not millions of Buddhists now in other parts of the world, including Europe, the United Kingdom, the United States, South America, North America, other parts of North America, etc. And so the key criterion, I would say, across all lineages within Buddhism that formulate the core of, in effect, what is a Buddhist, is the three refuges, or the three treasures. In other words, expressing the notion that I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, which is the teaching of the Buddha, and I take refuge in the Sangha, or the followers of Buddhism. Those are the kinds of commitments, and it doesn't have to be even, I think, a formal thing for one to say I'm a Buddhist. And of course, I don't think you actually have to be exclusively Buddhist either. I have a close friend who is a rabbi, and he and I share information and literature that highlights the fact that there have been many from the Jewish tradition that have found their way to Buddhism and found some very valuable things within the Buddhist tradition. And those two traditions have enriched each other as they have interacted. And the same is true, frankly, of Christianity, where there are an increasing number of Christians that appreciate some of the Buddhist kinds of approaches to meditation and so forth. And of course, from another perspective, all the major religious traditions have a mystical component, that these really are all pointing to the same kind of experience, namely that sense of non-duality that I've referenced earlier in this video and also in many other videos. Are there rituals or prayers in Buddhism? Well, I'll focus more there on the idea of rituals. And yes, there are many rituals. Again, just like with the holidays, I'm not as familiar with them. And if you want to really focus on rituals, I would particularly point you to the Tibetan Buddhists, who have a whole array of rituals, including one that's very interesting and enlightening when one reflects upon it, which I actually observed not that long ago, within the past 6 months, since the Tibetan monks were in our town and did their sand mandala. They created a mandala very meticulously over several days, this beautiful, beautiful construction, portrayal of a design that symbolized Avalokiteshvara, or the Bodhisattva of infinite compassion. And at the end of the process, after the several days of creating this masterpiece, they systematically destroyed it, which is amazing, after all that work. But again, part of what it symbolizes is the fundamental notion of impermanence, which is one of the basic ideas within Buddhism when Buddhists describe what is the nature of reality, what is the nature of existence, what is the nature of our life. Our life and everything around us is impermanent. And if one reflects deeply, one realizes the truth of that fundamental statement. Anyhow, that ritual kind of symbolizes the process. Have you completed your path? Short answer, no. And as far as my own belief system within Shin Buddhism, I won't complete my path in this lifetime. On the other hand, I'm not relegated to having multiple lifetimes of continual rebirth in this human form, which involves so much suffering and dissatisfaction, because within the belief system as a Shin Buddhist, I believe that I will complete my path when I am reborn in the Pure Land of Bliss, Amida's Pure Land, when I die. Actually, though, then in some ways I will elect to judge my path as not being complete, in the sense that instead of attaining Buddhahood at that point, even though I will be a Buddha, I will then transform into a Bodhisattva and come back and help others toward their own accomplishment of movement on the spiritual path, their own development of a raft that they can use to get across the sea of suffering to the other shore. And in fact, it won't just be a small raft, but it will be a great raft, a great vehicle, a large ship that hopefully can get everybody across to the other shore of enlightenment. And it's when everybody is free of suffering that my path will be complete. Namu Amida Buts. Namu Amida Buts. Namu Amida Buts.